They spent my college fund on my brother's dream car and laughed at my startup. 1 week after my parents humiliated me, the daughter they ignored appeared on TV, and suddenly their world turned upside down. I couldn't believe my eyes. The envelope in my hand felt heavier than it should, like it carried the weight of every insult, every snide remark, every dismissive word my parents had ever thrown my way. My hand shook as I tore it open, heart racing, and there it was, the statement confirming that my college fund, the fund I had relied on to secure my education and my future, had been spent. On what exactly? A car. A flashy, overpriced, gleaming car for my brother? My brother, the one who had never shown interest in learning, never stayed late grinding on a project, never built anything of his own. I felt the room spin. I sank into the chair, gripping the letter, trying to calm my racing mind. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, I had poured myself into my startup, living on instant noodles, sacrificing nights and weekends, believing in something that could actually change my life. And every time I brought up my ideas, my parents had rolled their eyes, dismissing my work as childish or pointless. Yet here they were, showering their golden boy with luxury, applauding his reckless indulgence while mocking my ambition. My stomach churned. Anger, disbelief, and betrayal collided, forming a knot that refused to loosen. I had trusted them. I had believed they would nurture me, encourage me, maybe even invest in me if I showed them results. But instead, I had been laughed at. I was sidelined. My dreams had been belittled, and my sacrifices had been invisible. I couldn't stay in that chair. I paced the room, letting the anger flow through me. I remembered the countless times I had pitched my startup ideas over family dinners, only to hear snickers and condescending remarks. "Why don't you focus on something realistic?" my mother would say. "Your brother is smart. He knows how to make money," my father would add, completely ignoring the sweat, the tears, and the late nights I had devoted to building my future. But the seed of defiance had already been planted. I had been underestimated my entire life. Every dismissal, every sneer, every casual insult had only made me stronger, sharper, more determined. I realized, in that raw, searing moment of betrayal, that the same family who had ridiculed me was about to witness the truth. I wasn't the powerless child they thought I was. I was capable. I was resourceful. And I would make sure they never doubted me again. I leaned back, taking a deep breath, letting the anger transform into strategy. This wasn't a moment for a meltdown or impulsive retaliation. That would be too easy, and it wouldn't hurt them where it mattered most. No, the real power lay in patience, in turning their ignorance into leverage, in letting them see me rise on my own terms. I have given my family multiple chances to be a change, and this last encounter was one of them, and they still fail. Ignoring my startup and funding my brother's lavish dream car was not just a betrayal, but a huge mistake from them. Now that very startup, the last few months had been exhausting but promising. I had secured a deal with a developer that could generate over $30 million in revenue, and interest from multiple firms was growing rapidly. Soon, the entire city would know my name, not just as their daughter, but as a force in the business world. I imagined the looks on their faces when they realized that the money they had squandered on my brother's car could never compare to the empire I was quietly building. A small, wicked smile crept across my face. They had laughed at me, ignored me, and handed their favoritism to someone unworthy. But they hadn't seen this coming. They didn't know the depth of my ambition, the precision of my planning, or the strength of my resolve. Every hour I had spent building my business, every sleepless night, every sacrifice, it had all been leading to this moment. And soon, I would reveal it. I imagined the moment vividly, my parents watching me on TV, seeing the CEO of a thriving company standing tall, confident, and untouchable. The shock, the regret, the scrambling. I could almost hear the panic in their voices, the frantic missed calls, the desperate pleas. And I would answer none of them, at least not that I will be obligated to. They needed to feel the weight of their choices, to understand what it meant to underestimate someone like me. I also thought of my brother, The so-called golden child, the one who had been praised for having a flashy car and no responsibility. He had no idea how precarious his finances truly were, nor did he know how easily his indulgence could collapse under real scrutiny. And when it did, he would have to come to me. Every call unanswered, every request ignored, every plea met with calm, deliberate composure. That would be my leverage. But first, I had to focus on my own momentum. I reviewed my deals, planned my next meetings, and mapped out the next steps to scale my startup. The betrayal was still fresh, a sharp, burning edge, but I converted it into energy. I wouldn't let it consume me. I would let it fuel me. Each action I took now was a brick in the foundation of my future, a future where their opinions, their ridicule, and their favoritism meant nothing. And yet, despite the anger, there was clarity. I wasn't doing this to punish them out of spite. No, this was bigger. This was about justice in its purest form. Justice for the years I had been overlooked, underestimated, and ignored. The betrayal of my college fund had been a catalyst, a clear signal that I needed to reclaim not just what was lost, but my power, my credibility, and my dignity. By the time I left the house that evening, my resolve was ironclad. The seeds of revenge and vindication had been planted, but carefully, deliberately. I would let my family continue in their ignorance for a little while longer. Let them think I was powerless. Let them continue underestimating me. And then, when the timing was perfect, I would show them the reality, that I, Claire, was untouchable, unstoppable, and in complete control of my destiny. Because the truth was simple. They had underestimated me for years, but now they were about to learn exactly who they had crossed. A week had passed since I walked out of that humiliating dinner with my parents, their laughter still echoing in my mind. But instead of letting it fester into bitterness, I channeled it into action. I had a plan, a vision, and now, a fire that refused to be ignored. That fire drove me into my office early every morning, long before the city awoke, and kept me there late at night when the streets were silent. I remember the exact moment the deal came together. I was sitting across from a real estate developer in his sleek downtown office, the sun cutting golden lines through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I had prepared for this meeting for days, every figure, every contingency, every potential objection memorized and rehearsed. I leaned forward, confident but calm, and laid out my proposal, a $30 million development that would not only be profitable, but set a new benchmark for innovative urban living. The developer raised his eyebrows, clearly impressed. "You've thought of everything," he said, his tone a mixture of admiration and disbelief. I wasn't expecting such foresight from someone so young. I smiled, letting the compliment land but not defining me. "It's all about preparation," I replied, "and having a clear vision." As the handshake sealed the deal, a wave of satisfaction washed over me. This wasn't just money, it wasn't just success. It was validation, the kind I had been denied my entire life by the very people who should have believed in me. My parents had spent my college fund on a car for my brother, sneered at my startup, and laughed at my ambition. Now here I was, securing multi-million-dollar deals, while they remained blind to my achievements. The following days were a whirlwind. Firms began reaching out, each eager to explore partnerships, eager to ride the momentum I had generated. They wanted to meet the girl who pulled such a deal as a first-timer. I meticulously reviewed contracts, negotiated terms, and strengthened relationships with key players. Every phone call, every email, every meeting was an opportunity to reinforce that I was no longer the overlooked daughter. They had assumed me powerless for too long, but it wasn't just about the money. It was about proving, to myself and the world, that I had built something meaningful from the ground up. Every detail of this project was mine, from the innovative designs to the financial strategy. Every hurdle I overcame only reinforced my resilience, and as I worked, I imagined the reactions of my family when they finally realized that the girl they ridiculed had quietly outpaced them all. I remember walking through the development site a few days later, hard hat perched on my head, blueprints in hand. The skeletal frames of new buildings stretched into the sky, promising something extraordinary. I felt an exhilarating sense of ownership, a deep connection to something that bore my mark, my vision. Unlike my parents' shallow admiration for my brother's possessions, this was real, lasting, and entirely my own. Emails poured in from interested investors, each one a testament to my growing reputation. I responded to each with precision and professionalism, reinforcing the image I had cultivated. Claire, a capable, formidable, self-reliant woman who was not to be underestimated. The thrill wasn't just in the deals themselves. It was in the knowledge that every move I made was a subtle message to the family who had belittled me for so long. At night, I would sit at my desk and review everything that had happened. The turn of events was almost unbelievable. Just a week ago, I had been the butt of their jokes, dismissed for daring to dream. And now, the city's most prominent firms were calling me, eager to work with me, impressed by my ingenuity and leadership. The tide had shifted, and the first ripple of it would soon reach my parents. The tension I felt wasn't for myself, it was for them. I imagined the moment they saw me on television or in the news, my name and accomplishments splashed across the headlines. The disbelief, the jealousy, the sudden realization that they had underestimated me for decades. It was a private thrill, a vindication I savored quietly. I didn't need to call or boast. I simply let my actions speak for themselves. I also began thinking about my brother, the so-called golden child who was fully backed by my parent. He had been reckless, irresponsible, and dependent on their praise. I knew little of the debts he had accumulated, or the house he had put up as collateral without telling anyone. I realized that soon he would have to come to me, the very sister they had scorned. That thought brought a sharp sense of control. I wasn't just building my empire, I was establishing leverage over the entire family dynamic. Every negotiation, every step forward in my project was a statement. I was no longer a girl to be mocked. I was a force, and while some may have doubted me, those doubts only fueled my meticulous planning and execution. I was relentless, not just in ambition but in precision. Each contract was carefully reviewed, each partnership carefully cultivated, each move calculated to ensure that when the time came, my family would see the full extent of my power. Late one evening, after finalizing a partnership that secured additional investment in my project, I leaned back and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The city lights glimmered beyond my office window, a silent witness to my ascent. In that quiet moment, I reflected on everything, the ridicule, the disbelief, the belittlement, and understood something profound. None of it had broken me. In fact, it had shaped me into someone unstoppable. I knew the shockwave would be immense once the news reached my family. It was the media insight coverage day, and I wasn't even aware I had made it to the TV broadcast. And what followed was 79 missed calls on my phone, each one a testament to their panic, their sudden recognition that I had outpaced them. But I didn't answer. I let the silence stretch, letting the reality sink in. This was my victory, my narrative to control. I wasn't just succeeding for myself, I was rewriting the story they had dismissed, showing them what happens when you underestimate someone who quietly builds an empire behind your back. And as the week drew to a close, with my name now circulating among investors and media outlets alike, I felt the first taste of genuine empowerment. This wasn't just about wealth, it was about autonomy, respect, and undeniable proof that I, Claire, was a force to be reckoned with. The family who had mocked my vision and laughed at my ambitions had no choice but to recognize, eventually, that I was not only capable, but exceptional. This chapter of my life, this week of triumph, was just the beginning. The next steps would be even more strategic, even more calculated, as I prepared to confront the very people who had doubted me. The foundation had been laid, the empire had begun to rise, and the stage was set for a reckoning they would never forget. Because now, nothing could stop me. I didn't need to be in the same room to feel their panic. I watched from my sleek, sunlit office as the television aired my interview, showcasing the $30 million real estate deal I had just finalized. The camera captured me confidently outlining my plans, discussing innovative strategies, and fielding questions with ease. Every word, every smile, every nod of acknowledgement from the reporters reinforced what I already knew. I was unstoppable, and my parents watched. Somewhere in the suburban living room where they had once mocked my fledgling startup, I could imagine it, the sharp intake of breath, the frantic muttering, the disbelief that the girl they had belittled for years had quietly built something that now dwarfed their expectations. I smiled, leaning back in my chair, savoring the moment. They had spent my college fund on my brother's car, laughed at my ambition, and scorned my work. Now, all of that scorn reflected back at them in real time, and there was nothing they could do about it. I could feel their confusion and fear like a physical presence, and it was intoxicating. The irony wasn't lost on me. Their favorite child, the one they had coddled and praised, was now buried under debt. The house he had taken as collateral was teetering on the edge, and they had no idea how much leverage I held over the situation. 79 missed calls sat blinking on my phone, each one a desperate attempt to reach me, to plead, to negotiate, to reverse the reality they had ignored for years. And still, I didn't answer. Watching them squirm, imagining the frantic calculations racing through their minds, gave me a sense of calm power. I had always been the overlooked daughter, the one who quietly endured the comparisons, the teasing, the undermining remarks at every family gathering. They had assumed I was powerless, that my life would never reach the heights I envisioned. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. Patience is a weapon, and timing is everything. From my vantage point, I could see it all, the subtle gestures, the wide eyes, the almost imperceptible tremble in my mother's hands as she clutched the remote, trying to change the channel in vain. My father's confident posture had crumpled into tension. The very people who had once wielded their approval as a tool to manipulate me now had no control whatsoever. I allowed myself a quiet laugh, not loud enough to be heard, but enough to punctuate the thought that had been simmering for years. They had underestimated me, and the cost of that underestimation was now fully theirs. My brother's debts, his risky collateral, his spiraling financial decisions, all of it now intertwined with the reality that I was untouchable, in control, and unshakable. I recalled the moments from my childhood when they celebrated my brother's smallest victories while ignoring mine. The hours spent perfecting my skills, building my business, learning the nuances of real estate development, all for what? For this moment. For the satisfaction of seeing their arrogance and favoritism crumble before my quiet success. And it wasn't just about money, it was about respect. They had believed they could diminish me, dismiss my intelligence, and label my achievements as inconsequential. Watching them now, helpless and flustered, was confirmation that their assumptions were wrong. Their mockery had been their own undoing, and I had turned their ignorance into a strategic advantage. I leaned closer to the screen, noting my own composed demeanor, my calm voice explaining complex financial structures, my assured posture as if I had always belonged here, in the limelight. Every viewer who watched this interview saw a woman of power, vision, and authority, qualities they had once denied me in private conversations and subtle snubs. It was the perfect form of revenge, silent, calculated, undeniable. I didn't need to shout or confront them directly. My accomplishments spoke louder than any argument or lecture ever could. The television screen was my podium, my boardroom, my courtroom, and my parents were powerless witnesses. As I continued to watch, I began to imagine their frantic conversations behind closed doors. My father, the one who had always prided himself on his control over the family, likely pacing, trying to make sense of the sudden shift in family dynamics. My mother, who had delivered backhanded compliments and cutting comparisons at every opportunity, probably clutching her pearls in disbelief. Every reaction was a testament to the years of patience, planning, and relentless focus I had invested. And my brother? I smiled at the thought of him. The golden child, the favorite, now burdened with a debt he couldn't simply laugh off or inherit as privilege. He would soon have to acknowledge the reality I had become, the one he and my parents had overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed. The girl they thought would fail quietly had emerged as their unassailable equal, if not superior, in business and intellect. The suspense, the tension, the emotional upheaval, all of it played out like a carefully directed scene, and I was both the author and the star. I felt a rare satisfaction, a mixture of vindication and liberation. The strategic patience, the quiet ambition, the resilience in the face of ridicule, it had all led to this. Even as I watched them flounder, I remained composed. There was no gloating, no unnecessary confrontation. The beauty of it was in the silent acknowledgement that their world had shifted. I didn't need to call or explain. I didn't need to justify my success. They would come to understand eventually that I had been building, quietly and effectively, all along. By the end of the broadcast, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was a revelation. I had shown, without saying a word directly to them, that their scorn had no power over me, that their favoritism had been misplaced, and that their assumptions were catastrophically wrong. And as I powered down the television, I knew the next phase was approaching. My leverage over the family, my control over the dynamics they had once manipulated, was growing. They had no choice but to reckon with the reality. Claire, the overlooked daughter, was now the one with the power, the money, and the influence. I watched the phone buzz, again and again, 79 missed calls blinking on the screen like tiny alarms of panic. I didn't answer a single one, not because I wanted to be cruel, but because this was a lesson years in the making. A lesson my parents had never learned, a lesson they had refused to acknowledge when I was the overlooked, belittled daughter. For decades, they had favored my brother, indulged him, encouraged him to take risks without consequence, while I was constantly reminded of my failures and my supposed inadequacies. Every college fund that should have supported my dreams had been funneled into his latest toy, this time a flashy car he didn't need, purchased while they laughed at the idea of my fledgling startup. Now, the tables had turned. I held the leverage and I wielded it quietly, calmly, with precision. With the $30 million deal now secured and my reputation solidified as a formidable real estate developer, I could have called, explained, or forgiven. But I didn't. The satisfaction wasn't in confrontation. It was in watching their panic, their scrambling, their sudden awareness that the child they had underestimated had become untouchable. I imagined my father pacing the living room, phone pressed to his ear, desperately trying to reach me. Every missed call was a question he couldn't answer, a demand he couldn't fulfill. My mother's voice, usually sharp and dismissive, was reduced to frantic murmurs over my brother's predicament. They had spent years dismissing me, and now I was the one holding the reins. The irony was delicious. My brother's debts were mounting, the house already pledged as collateral, and their golden boy's empire was on the brink of implosion. All of it, the years of indulgence, the unquestioned favoritism, had led to this very moment, and I, the overlooked daughter, was calmly observing the consequence of their negligence. I didn't gloat. That would have been obvious. Instead, I allowed subtlety to do the work for me. I monitored the situation, checking updates on the financial mess my brother had created, noting every frantic conversation, every plea for assistance, every whispered confession of panic that leaked from their frantic phone calls. Each moment reinforced my sense of strategic control. This wasn't just revenge, it was validation. Every hour I had spent building my startup, every sleepless night, every small triumph that had been ignored, was now amplified in the silent acknowledgement of their helplessness. They were experiencing firsthand the consequences of their favoritism, and it was perfect. Not cruel, but instructive. I thought back to the subtle moments from my youth, the birthday gifts I had been denied, the achievements minimized, the words of doubt planted in my mind by the very people who claimed to love me. That long history of dismissal fueled my current satisfaction. This wasn't chaos for the sake of chaos. It was measured, precise, and thoroughly deserved. And yet, I remained composed. To anyone observing me, I was calm, even serene. But inside there was a thrill, a quiet triumph that came from knowing that I had turned the power dynamics upside down without saying a word. Every panicked call, every desperate message, every frantic inquiry into my availability to help my brother reinforced my sense of authority. I was in control, not just of my own life, but of the narrative they had constructed around me for so long. I thought about how different this felt from the old days. I remembered family dinners where my contributions were dismissed, my ideas mocked, and my successes minimized. Now, the same voices that had once ridiculed me were faltering under the weight of reality. My parents, who had once held unchallenged sway over my life, were now subject to the consequences of their choices. As the day progressed, the tension mounted. My brother had no choice but to face the reality he had ignored. And my parents had to come to terms with the fact that their assumptions about me had been catastrophically wrong. The pride they had lavished on their favorite child now became a source of anxiety, as the very privileges they had taken for granted were collapsing. I allowed myself a small smile, not a triumphant grin, but a quiet acknowledgement of the years of preparation, resilience, and strategic patience that had led to this moment. This was empowerment, not vengeance. The lesson was clear. I was not a daughter to be sidelined, overlooked, or dismissed. I was a force to be reckoned with, and they were finally realizing it. Yet, even as I reveled in their disarray, I maintained focus. This wasn't the end. It was the penultimate move in a carefully orchestrated game. I had established control. I had made the consequences clear, and I had demonstrated my power. The final act, the moment where my independence and authority would be fully cemented, was still to come. As the sun dipped behind the city skyline, I considered my next steps. Assistance, if given, would be on my terms. Support would not be automatic or unconditional. I had spent too long giving to those who neither respected nor valued me. My generosity would now be measured, deliberate, and aligned with my values. They had learned their lesson the hard way, and so I waited. The missed calls remained unanswered, each one a testament to my patience and strategic acumen. Every family member, in their panic, was forced to confront the reality I had quietly built around me. Claire, the once overlooked daughter, was now the arbiter of their fortune, the holder of their leverage, and the orchestrator of their humility. The day closed with a sense of calm authority. I wasn't celebrating destruction, I was establishing boundaries. I wasn't gloating. I was demonstrating the power of patience, resilience, and foresight. The consequences my family faced were the natural outcome of their favoritism, ignorance, and failure to recognize my potential. And as I sat back, reviewing reports, checking communications, and planning the next phase of my strategy, I felt an unparalleled sense of control. The lesson had been delivered, the stage set for final resolution, and I was fully empowered. My parents' scramble was not humiliation, it was clarity. Their child, the one they had ignored, had become unstoppable. The next chapter would be about finalizing my independence, cementing my authority, and defining the boundaries that would govern my relationships moving forward. For now, though, I allowed myself the rare indulgence of satisfaction. Years of dismissal and belittlement, balanced by one moment of undeniable leverage and control. I watched the sunlight glint off the skyscraper windows, reflecting the world I had built with my own hands. A week ago, my parents were panicked, my brother scrambling to salvage his debts, and the calls had kept coming. 79 missed messages, begging, pleading, demanding. Today the situation was entirely different. I had turned chaos into control, anxiety into authority, and doubt into undeniable proof of my independence. It wasn't arrogance that filled me, but clarity. Every decision I'd made, every calculated pause, every quiet moment of observation had led to this point. My brother's debts were now addressed, but on my terms. I had allocated funds strategically, ensuring the loans, the houses, the collateral, everything was handled, yet the leverage remained firmly in my hands. I wasn't rescuing him out of guilt. I was securing my domain, asserting my boundaries, and reminding everyone that I would no longer be sidelined. I thought back to those years of quiet ambition. Every family dinner where my ideas were dismissed, every achievement minimized, every subtle insult had been fuel. I had been the overlooked, the mocked, the child they assumed would always be smaller than her brother. And yet, here I was, undeniable, untouchable, unstoppable. It wasn't luck. It wasn't their approval that had built me. It was diligence, vision, and a refusal to let their favoritism define my worth. When I finally spoke to my parents, the tone was polite but edged with unspoken understanding. They weren't proud in the way that mattered. They weren't offering admiration for my accomplishments out of respect or recognition, but they had no choice. Their golden boy was indebted, their finances precarious, and I held the keys to stability. "Claire, we didn't realize," my mother stammered, the first cracks in her usual haughty composure appearing. I let the silence hang, letting the weight of everything unsaid settle between us. She realized, finally, that her blind favoritism had consequences. I didn't need to explain the years of ridicule, the countless times I had been minimized. She understood the magnitude without a word from me. That was the power of quiet triumph. The message was delivered without confrontation. My father's eyes darted nervously as he spoke. "You've really built something extraordinary." "Yes," I replied evenly, my voice steady, unwavering. "Something you chose to ignore until the consequences of your choices landed at your doorstep." They squirmed. I could see the discomfort in their posture. The subtle anxiety that came from recognizing the child they undervalued had surpassed them in authority, in intellect, and in resilience. This wasn't humiliation. It was accountability, delivered through competence and strategic patience. Meanwhile, my brother's calls continued, desperate and frantic. I addressed his obligations with the efficiency of a CEO managing a major acquisition, ensuring every payment, every collateral issue, and every financial gap was handled. Yet my assistance was strictly transactional. I didn't coddle, I didn't overextend. He learned the hard way what it meant to rely solely on himself. I had no interest in saving him emotionally. This was about demonstrating the consequences of poor judgment and indulgence. As I orchestrated these final maneuvers, a sense of liberation settled over me. I had reclaimed the narrative of my life. I was no longer the girl who was laughed at, dismissed, or compared unfavorably to a brother who inherited privilege. I was the architect of my destiny, and the world, including my family, could no longer deny it. Even my parents' apologies when they came were hollow. They weren't expressions of genuine insight or understanding. They were acknowledgments of necessity. They had realized that I could not be manipulated, that my resources were no longer available to subsidize their favoritism or my brother's recklessness. And yet, in that acknowledgement lay my satisfaction. I didn't need love, approval, or validation from them. I needed recognition of boundaries, and I had firmly established them. I thought about the lessons I had internalized along the way. Independence isn't built on permission, it's forged in persistence. Success isn't a favor granted, it's a claim made. Respect isn't demanded, it's earned through competence, courage, and clarity. Every misstep they had taken, every assumption they had made, had been a brick in the foundation of the empire I was now standing on. Sitting in my office later that evening, I reflected on the journey, from college funds stolen to ridicule at family gatherings, from being underestimated to orchestrating leverage that made them scramble. I had transformed every insult into insight, every obstacle into opportunity. The path wasn't easy, but the result was undeniable. Autonomy, authority, and a vision that could not be shaken. And yet, I didn't gloat. My triumph wasn't about rubbing their faces in failure. It was about establishing my life on my own terms. I would help when it aligned with my values, but blind trust or unconditional support was no longer an option. that part of me, the daughter, the sister, the woman who once gave freely without acknowledgement, had matured into a leader who recognized that power is measured in boundaries and decisions, not approval or applause. The final steps of empowerment were subtle, yet profound. I formalized my business operations, ensured my projects were on track, and confirmed that my influence extended not through intimidation, but through competence, vision, and undeniable authority. My family had witnessed the shift. They were aware, humbled, and in some cases humbled to the point of fear, but I remained composed, measured, and above all, in control. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the city skyline, I allowed myself a quiet acknowledgement of victory. This was the culmination of strategy, resilience, and long-term vision. I had taken the tools of betrayal, indifference, and neglect and turned them into stepping stones for my success. No one had given me permission, no one had supported me adequately, but I had built my future anyway. And so I stood poised, confident, and untouchable. The family that once mocked me, the brother who relied on their indulgence, the parents who undervalued me, they now existed in a world where I was the fulcrum of influence, the decision-maker, and the arbiter of outcomes. My independence was secured, my power was undeniable, and my life was entirely my own. This was the true triumph: independence earned, authority established, and respect, when it came, commanded without compromise. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe.